I came to Firebase Calder to write about a road. That was the assignment anyway. A wire editor with 3 days' growth of beard and a coffee habit had leaned across his desk and told me the public had grown tired of the big set-piece battles, the kind that came with maps and arrows and a general willing to be quoted. He wanted small, he wanted forgotten. He wanted a piece about the men who held the little outposts at the far end of a supply line that nobody in the capital could find on a map, the places where the war was mostly mud and waiting and the slow grinding patience of being a long way from anything that could help you. There was a ridge above a river ford, he said, where a single road came up out of the valley and ended at a string of sandbags and a flag. The road had washed out twice that season. He wanted to know what it was like to be a man at the end of a road like that. I had been a correspondent for 19 years by then. I had stopped believing in heroes around year 6 and I had stopped pretending to believe in them around year 10, which is a different and lonelier thing. I went where the stories were because the stories were the only thing I still trusted, and I had learned to write them the way they actually happened, which is to say small and confused and rarely about anybody being brave. The brave ones, in my experience, were mostly dead, and the live ones were mostly tired, and the difference between a hero and a man who had simply been unlucky enough to survive was, more often than not, a difference invented later by people who hadn't been there. I had made a small, comfortable career out of telling that to readers who found it bracing. So I rode up the last passable stretch of that road in the bed of a supply truck with my pack between my knees and the rain coming down in the steady, patient way it comes down in those highlands, and I thought about how to make a story out of nothing, which is the only real skill the job ever taught me. The truck could not make the top. The road had slid again about 1.5 miles below the crest, a long brown tongue of it gone down the mountainside into the trees, and so I walked the rest with 2 soldiers who carried mortar rounds on their backs and did not speak to me. The rounds were heavy and the men were young and they leaned into the slope with the particular grim economy of men who have learned that complaining costs breath they cannot spare. The mud was the kind that takes a boot and considers keeping it. Twice I went down to a knee and a soldier hauled me up by the strap of my pack without a word, the way you'd write a fence post, and set me back on my feet and kept climbing. By the time the wire and the sandbags came up out of the fog, I was wet through to the skin and had stopped feeling the cold, which is its own kind of warning that nobody tells you about. Firebase Calder sat on a shoulder of high ground with the ford below it and the long draw running up from the valley floor to the wire. There was a cut-off element on the ridge itself, a piece of a company pushed forward to watch the crossing, and they were the men I had come to write about. There were not many of them. There is never a romantic word for how few there are at a place like that. You learn to count the holes and the helmets and to keep the number to yourself, because saying it out loud does something to the air. There were a couple of mortar pits dug into the forward edge and a pair of howitzers down at the parent base behind the shoulder, out of sight and out of the small arm's reach of anything coming up the draw, and a lieutenant younger than my eldest son, and a platoon sergeant who looked at me the way a farmer looks at a dog that has wandered onto his land and might be useful and might need shooting. His name was Tasker, First Sergeant Roy Tasker, though everyone simply called him First Sergeant, in the way that a title becomes a man's whole name when he has earned it hard enough. He had a face like the road I had walked up, weathered and slid and rebuilt, and forearms like cabled rope, and he had been at this longer than I had been writing about it. He took one look at my notebook and my soft hands and decided exactly what I was, and he was not wrong, and I respected him for it a little. "You want the men?" he said. It was not a question. "You'll get the men, stay out of the wire after dark and don't write anything that gets read out at somebody's funeral. I've heard your kind of story read out at a funeral before. The family doesn't need clever. The family needs the truth plain, and you people are mostly out of the habit of plain." I said I would try. "Try harder than try," he said and turned to go, and then he paused, and a thing happened in his face that I would think about for a long time afterward. It was contempt, but it was contempt with an edge of grievance to it, the way a man's voice changes when he is about to complain about something that has personally aggravated him. He nodded down the line toward a low command tent with a radio antenna lashed to a stake and the antenna swaying in the rain. "And that's the fire support officer they sent us," he said. "If you're looking for color, the captain, you'll want a word with the captain." He put a weight on the word that I cannot reproduce on paper. It was not the weight of a man saying the rank of someone he respected. Came up 4 days ago with a map case and a box of grease pencils and started telling my men where to dig. "We're cut off out here on the edge of nothing. We've got fewer rifles than a man would want, and a road that quits whenever the sky feels like it. And the army in its wisdom decided what this ridge needed before anything else it might need, before more men, before a road that holds, was a switchboard. A woman to sit in a tent and draw on a map and run a radio. 4 days I've had my boys digging holes," she points at, "holes they can't see the use of, holes in the rain when they could have been resting or improving the wire that actually stops a man with a rifle. A switchboard." He shook his head, and the grievance in it was real, and I understood it because I would have felt it too. You want color, writer, there's your color. I did not understand the word yet, I would. She was sitting on an ammunition crate inside the open flap of the tent with a map board across her knees and a radio handset hooked over her shoulder, and she was drawing. That is the first true thing I can tell you about her, and it is the thing I got most wrong. She had a sheet of acetate over the map, and she was drawing on it with a grease pencil, small precise marks, numbers in tidy rows, little circles with crosses through them spaced out along the lines of the terrain. And she was doing it slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a person who has decided that doing a thing once and right is faster than doing it 3 times in a panic. And she did not look up when I came in out of the rain and stood there dripping on her floor. Captain Della Mercer. I would learn the name later. At the time I saw a woman of maybe 40, weathered the way the men were weathered, in the same mud-colored kit they all wore, with her hair cut short and pushed back wet from her forehead and her sleeves rolled to the elbow over forearms that were not soft. There was a fine white seam of an old scar running up the back of one of those forearms and disappearing into the rolled sleeve, the kind of scar a person stops noticing on themselves, and I noticed it and filed it the way I filed everything as a detail I might use, and thought nothing of what could have made it. She had a stillness to her that I read then, as the stillness of a clerk absorbed in paperwork, the stillness of someone who does the same careful, unimportant thing every day in a quiet room. I have since revised that reading. There is a stillness that comes from having nothing at stake, and there is a stillness that comes from having seen exactly how much is at stake and deciding a long time ago that you would not let it move your hands. They look the same from the door of a tent. They are not the same. One is the stillness of a pond. The other is the stillness of a held weight, of a thing that does not move because moving is precisely what it has trained its whole life not to do. You're the writer, she said, still drawing. Caro, I said, I'm doing a piece on the road. She made another mark. Everyone who comes up here is doing a piece on the road. The road's not the story. She finally looked up, and her eyes were the pale, steady gray of weather that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do to you, and she looked at me for about as long as it takes to size a man up and file him, and then she went back to the map. The draw's the story. You came up the road, did you look at the draw? I had not looked at the draw, I had looked at my feet. Because my feet were trying to leave me, and I said so, more or less, and she nodded as though that confirmed something she had already assumed about correspondence and feet. It comes up from the valley floor 1,000 meters out, she said. Wide at the bottom, narrows here. She tapped the acetate. Anybody who wants this ground has to come up the draw or across the ford, and the ford channels them just as bad. 2 ways up, both of them tight at the top. That's not a problem. That's a gift if you've laid the work in. People don't see gifts. They see 2 roads to their door and they get frightened of the doors. She capped the grease pencil and looked at it for a moment as if it were a tool of some seriousness, which I have come to understand it was. I've been here 4 days laying the work in. The first sergeant thinks I've been wasting his men's time making them dig holes in places they don't see the use of. Did he tell you that? He called you a switchboard, I said, because I am, at bottom, a man who repeats things to see what they'll do. For just a moment something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, that was older and more tired than a smile. He did, she said. Well, he'll find out what the switchboard's for. And she said it without heat, without the wounded edge I'd have put into it, the way you note that it was probably going to rain, and she stood up off the crate and slung the map board and said, walk with me if your feet will carry you. You wanted to see what a forgot outpost looks like. I'll show you the part nobody writes down, the part that doesn't photograph. So I walked the ground with her in the rain while the light failed, and that walk is the part of this story I am most ashamed of, because I spent the whole of it being clever in my head about how I would write her. I had the angle already. The earnest staff officer up from the rear, fussing over her maps while the real soldiers, the men, did the real soldiering, the diligent functionary. I had filed that woman 100 times in different uniforms, and she had always made good reliable color, the small, dutiful person against whom the brave ones could be measured. I followed her along the wire and into the trees at the edge of the perimeter, and I noted, the way you note things you intend to use, that she kept stopping at points that meant nothing to me and crouching and looking down the slope and making a small mark on her board, and that at each of these nothing points one of Tasker's exhausted men had over the last 4 days dug something or cached something or stacked something under a poncho. Target reference points, she said when I asked, in the tone of a woman explaining to a child why the stove is hot. Here, the mouth of the draw, call that one, the ford 2, the spur where the draw bends 3, the saddle behind us if they ever get behind us 4, I've shot all of them in. The guns at the parent base, the tubes on the ridge, they all know these 4 points by heart now. I don't have to describe the ground to them in the dark, I just have to say a number. She moved on a few paces and stopped again. Shooting a target in means firing a round or 2 at it in the daylight, watching where it lands, correcting until you've got it dead. Then you write down the data. After that the point lives in a notebook and in the gun crew's memory, and it doesn't matter if it's black as the inside of a boot and raining sideways. I say the number and steel lands there where I stood today and made the math behind it. When you can't see, numbers are how you keep from killing your own men. The first sergeant thinks numbers are how clerks avoid work. He's a good soldier, he's wrong about that one thing. She showed me the gun target line, though I did not understand a tenth of it, the angle from the howitzers to each point, why it mattered which way the steel would walk if a round fell long or short, how a correction of 50 meters in the wrong direction over the wrong terrain put it on your own people instead of theirs. She showed me where she'd had the mortar crews lay their tubes and how she'd made them rehearse in daylight, dropping their first rounds onto target 3 until they could do it in their sleep, until the act of putting a round on the spur was no longer a calculation but a reflex, a thing the hands knew. She told me she'd spent half of one of those 4 days on the weather, on the fact that the low cloud and the wet meant no aircraft would fly to help us none, and that a fire support officer who built a plan around aircraft that couldn't fly was building a plan around a prayer. You plan for the sky you've got, she said, not the sky you want. The sky I've got is sitting on the deck and it's not getting up, so this ridge holds on the tubes and the guns or it doesn't hold. And this, I pointed at a line of stakes hammered in just outside the wire, draped with the cached rounds and a tangle of wire, a thing that looked like a fence built by a drunkard. She stopped. She looked at it for a moment the way you look at a thing you have made carefully and may have to use. That's the last one, she said. That's the one I hope I never call final protective fire. If they get to the wire, if they're actually on it, in among us you bring the whole world down right there, on the wire, closer than you're ever supposed to. You bring it down on your own front porch and you trust the math, because the alternative is they come over the wire and then there's no math at all, no fire support, no anything, just men with knives in the dark, and we lose that. We always lose that when there are this many of them and this few of us, so you never let it get to knives. You bring the iron down on your own wire first. She started walking again. I've called it before, once, I'd rather not discuss it. I asked her where. It was an idle question, the kind you ask to fill the space while you climb. She didn't answer at first. She had gone somewhere for a second, behind those weather-colored eyes, and I watched her come back from it the way a person surfaces from cold water, and then all she said was, a long way from here and a while ago, and the way she said it closed the subject the way a door closes, and I let it because I was a coward about other people's old wars even then, and we walked the rest of the perimeter in a silence that I mistook for the silence of a tired clerk, and that was, I understand now, the silence of a woman walking the ground she intends to hold. We came back to the tent in full dark. The lieutenant was there, the boy who had the actual command of that cut-off piece of a company, and I could see at a glance the shape of things between him and the captain. He outranked her in the chain of that little hill in the sense that the infantry was his and the firebase was his to lose, and she was an attachment, a supporting arm, a guest with a specialty. But she had been at war longer than he had been shaving, and they both knew it, and he carried himself with the particular brittle correctness of a young officer who suspects he is being managed and has decided to resent it rather than be grateful for it. She did not manage him exactly. She offered. She would say, the draw worries me more than the ford, sir, and let him arrive at the rest. He would bristle anyway. Once while I was pretending to write, he told her flatly that he'd positioned his heaviest weapon to cover the ford, because the ford was the obvious crossing, and she said very mildly that the obvious crossing was the one a thoughtful enemy avoided, and that she'd be grateful if he'd consider waiting the draw, and he said he'd take it under advisement in a tone that meant he would not, and she nodded and let it go and went back to her acetate, and I wrote in my notebook, with what I thought was great insight, that the staff officer overreached and the line officer put her in her place. I had it precisely backward. I would learn how backward inside of a day. That night the rain got into everything. I lay in a half-dug shelter with my notebook against my chest to keep it dry, and I listened to the men, who did not know I was awake, talking about the captain. They were not cruel about it exactly. They were young and they were frightened in the bone-deep way men get frightened at the far end of a washed-out road, and they did what frightened young men do, which is to find the person who seems least like them and make her the joke that holds the fear at arm's length. The switchboard, the map lady, the one who'd never been shot at, who'd come up from a desk to play soldier where the real men were, who made them dig holes they couldn't see the use of. One of them did an impression of her capping a grease pencil, slow and solemn, and the others laughed, the tight, high laugh of men who badly need to. Tasker's word had spread the way a hard man's words do, and it had become the unit's small private religion, the thing they all agreed on so that they would not have to agree out loud on the worst thing, which was the arithmetic of fewer than 50 against whatever was gathering down in that valley. I lay there and I confess I added to it in my head, polished it, found the phrase I'd use. The diligent functionary. I thought about the lead the way you do. Something about how the great machine of an army in its remoteness sends a ridge of fighting men, a clerk, and a box of grease pencils when what they have asked for is help. It would write itself. It had a shape my readers liked, the small true human absurdity of war, the gap between the men dying at the edge and the system that did not understand them. I went to sleep pleased with myself. That is the kind of man I was. I am telling you this so that you will believe the rest, because a man who admits he was a fool about a thing has earned, I think, the right to tell you the truth about it. They came at dusk the next day, when the light was the color of dishwater and the rain had thinned to a mist that did nothing but ruin every chance of seeing. I want to tell it the way it happened, which means I have to tell it confused, because that is the only honest way, and then I will tell you what I understood afterward when I had the time to understand it. At the time there was only noise. It began with a single shot, far down, a flat, distant pop that might have been nothing, and then a silence in which every man on that ridge stopped moving, the way animals stop moving, and then the mortar pit on the forward edge went off, a flat hard cough that I felt in my back teeth, and a parachute flare went up and hung over the valley floor and turned the whole world the green-white of a bad dream. And in that light I saw the draw, the way she'd told me to look at it the day before and I hadn't, and the draw was moving. The whole throat of it, 1,000 meters out and coming, was moving, was alive, was full of men. I had heard the sound before in other places and had hoped never to hear it again, the sound of a great many men moving up a slope toward you with the intention of arriving. There is a kind of rushing, rattling murmur to it, like surf, like weather, and under the surf the first cracks of small arms, and then the murmur becomes a roar, and the roar has individual men in it screaming, and that is when your body understands before your mind does that this is not a probe and not a raid but the real thing, the thing the whole ridge had been built and dug and dreaded into being for. I have read accounts since of what came up the draw at Firebase Calder, and the lowest honest number anyone puts on it is near 600. 600 against a cut-off element that, with the gun crews and the wounded counted, came to fewer than 50 men. I had counted the helmets myself the first afternoon and kept the number to myself the way you do. 41 of us were on that ridge who could hold a weapon. 41. And down in the valley, near 600, and the road below us had slid again in the night with the rain, slid bad, a fresh long tongue of it gone, and the relief column that was supposed to be a long hour away was suddenly a thing measured not in hours but in weather at all. In the ceiling the clouds sat down on the ridge like a wet wool blanket, 200 feet off the deck, exactly as she had said it would, and that meant no aircraft, no miracle from above. The two things every man on that hill had been quietly counting on without admitting it, the road and the sky, were both gone inside the same half hour, and the men knew it, and I felt the knowing go through them like cold water. I felt it go through me. We were cut off, outnumbered better than 10 to 1 in the dark, in the rain, with no help coming and no help possible. The lieutenant was on the radio screaming for the relief column and getting back the flat voice of a man a long, impossible way down a washed-out road telling him the truth, which was nothing, working it. They were working the slide, they would come when they could come, and everyone who heard it understood that when they could come would be after, would be for the bodies. And the boy's voice climbed as he understood it too, climbed toward the place a voice goes right before it breaks. And that is the worst sound on a battlefield, worse than the guns, the sound of the man in command losing the thread, because the men hear it and it is the permission they have been waiting for to be as afraid as they already are. And then a round came in among us, a real one, a long ugly streak of tracer, and then the crump of it, and the lieutenant went down with his hand to his neck and his face full of surprise, just surprise, no pain in it yet, only the astonishment of a young man learning in one instant that he is not exempt, and a soldier dragged him into a hole by the collar, and for a moment, I will not lie about this, for a moment that hill came very close to coming apart. I saw it. I saw young men start to look over their shoulders at the dark behind them, which is the first thing that happens, the looking back, the body's animal computation of which way is away. And once enough of them look back, it is over, and they are not soldiers anymore but only frightened animals on a hill. And they die, every one, because there is nowhere on a cut-off ridge for animals to run to. Tasker held them. I will give the first sergeant that until the day I die. He came up the line in the mud roaring, hauling men back to the wire by their harnesses, his voice doing the thing a good sergeant's voice does, which is to be louder and angrier and more certain than your fear, so that you obey it the way you'd obey your own father on reflex before the fear can finish its argument. He got to the boy who was screaming that they were coming, and he took him by the front of his kit and put their helmets together and said something into his face that I couldn't hear over the noise, low and hard, and the boy stopped screaming and turned around and faced the draw, and that one act, that one turned around boy steadied the 4 men nearest him, and for a few minutes that whole line held on Tasker alone, on the rope of his voice strung from man to man. But Tasker could not be everywhere, and there were too many coming, and rifles do not stop 600 men coming up a draw in the dark. Nothing a rifle can do stops that. The men knew it, Tasker knew it. I watched his face in the muzzle flashes, the weathered, slid, rebuilt face of him, and I saw him doing the arithmetic that has only one answer, and I saw him decide to die well, because that was the only decision the arithmetic left him, and there was a kind of peace come into his face when he decided it that frightened me worse than anything else that night. And under all of it, the whole time, there had been a voice on the radio I'd stopped hearing the way you stop hearing rain. It was hers, calm, not loud, lower than the noise somehow so that you had to lean toward it, which is a thing I have never understood and have stopped trying to. She was at the open flap of the command tent on her ammunition crate with the handset against her cheek and the map board on her knees and a red-lensed light held in her teeth so her hands stayed free, and she was drawing while she talked, marking the acetate, and she was talking to the guns. She had been talking to them since the first cough of the mortar. While the lieutenant screamed and the men looked back and Tasker did his arithmetic, she had been sitting there in the rain, unhurried, saying numbers. Calder, this is Anvil, fire mission, target reference 1, the draw, troops in the open, danger close, I authenticate, and a string of words I didn't follow, and then she read off something to the gun, an adjustment, and then a pause that lasted about as long as it takes the heart to forget how to beat, the longest pause I have ever lived through. And into my ear came her voice once more, flat and cert, splash over, and the world ended 1,000 meters down the draw. I had been near artillery before. I had never been the man it was being fired for. There is no describing it that does not sound like a man reaching for a bigger word than exists. The whole valley floor lifted. The mist lit orange from underneath and the surf roar of the men coming up the draw changed in an instant, in a single instant, from a roar of arrival to something else. A higher and more terrible sound, and then she said, perfectly level, perfectly calm, as if she were reading a grocery list, Calder, Anvil, drop 50, fire for effect, and did it again and walked it up the draw toward us. Steel falling in long ripples up the throat of the ground exactly where she had stood 4 days before with her grease pencil making a small mark at a nothing point, and the first wave of 600 men broke against numbers she had written down in the rain. I understood it then, all of it. Standing in the mud with my notebook ruined against my chest and my clever angle gone out of me like air out of a man who's been hit, I understood the 4 days of digging, and the stakes and the targets shot in, and the weather she'd planned around, and the mortar crews she drilled until their hands knew the spur in the dark, and the whole patient, unglamorous architecture of what she had built on that ridge, while the men called her a switchboard. She had not been doing homework. She had been laying a trap with the ground itself, with the math of falling iron and the shape of 2 narrow ways up a hill, and now she was springing it in the dark by the simple act of saying a number, and the men who could not see 10 feet in the rain were being saved by a woman who had memorized the dark in advance. She broke the first wave in the draw. Then I heard the assault shift, heard the weight of it slide toward the ford the way she'd said a thoughtful enemy would, away from the killing she'd just done, and she was already there ahead of them. Calder, Anvil, target reference 2, the ford, and she dropped the guns onto the channeled water where they had to bunch to cross, and the second wave broke at the crossing, broke in the white water she'd marked as a nothing point days before. And when a knot of them peeled off and tried to come up the bend of the spur, the clever ones, the ones who'd seen 2 waves die and thought to find a third road, she had the on-ridge mortars on them before they'd gone 50 meters, target 3, the spur the crews could hit in their sleep because she'd made them rehearse it, and that knot of clever men ceased on the spur in the dark. All of it in that low, even voice. Drop 50, at 100, fire for effect, repeat. While the rounds whispered and roared and the men on the wire, the men who had called her the map lady who had done impressions of her capping a grease pencil began slowly, the way you turn toward warmth, to listen to her instead of to their fear. I watched it happen to one boy near me, a private who could not have been 20, who had been firing his rifle wild into the dark with his face screwed up like a child's. He heard her say target 2, the ford, and he heard the ford come apart, and he turned his head and looked back toward the tent where her voice came from, and something in his face changed, settled, found a floor under it. He stopped firing wild. He started firing aimed. He had found in the middle of the worst night of his life a thing to trust, and the thing was a number and a calm voice saying it, and it held him up. The first sergeant got to her about an hour in. I was near enough to hear it. He came down the line out of the dark with blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, moving in the crouched purposeful way of a man checking his perimeter, and he stood over her ammunition crate, this hard-slid, weathered man, and I think he meant to give her an order because that was the shape his whole life had pressed him into, the shape that put a senior sergeant in charge of the practical defense of a piece of ground. And then he heard her finish a correction, and he heard the steel come down on the spur exactly where she'd said it would, and he heard the screaming stop where she'd made it stop, and the order died in him. I watched it die. He crouched down beside the crate instead. He put his bloody hand flat on the mud to steady himself, and he said, and I will never forget the smallness of it in that big man's mouth, the way a man's voice goes when something he was certain of has turned over in his hands, Captain. What do you need from me? I need that wire to hold, she said, not looking up, drawing again, marking the fall of each round on her acetate so she'd never lose track in the dark of where her own steel had been and where her own men were. I need every man on the wire, and I need them to stay there no matter what comes up that draw, because if they break and run I can't shoot for them anymore. The second they're scattered and moving in the dark, I can't tell them from the enemy, and I won't drop steel where I can't tell. So I need them still and I need them on the wire. Can you give me that, First Sergeant? I can give you that, Tasker said. Then give it to me, she said, and let me work, and he went and he gave it to her. And the strangest thing in all that strange night was watching the first sergeant carry her quiet certainty up the line to his frightened men like a man carrying fire in his cupped hands, telling them, the captain's got the draw, the captain's got the ford, you hold the wire and the captain holds everything past it, and them believing it because by then they had seen it, they had seen the dark come apart on her command. Again and again, in the exact places she'd warned about, and a man will believe his own eyes about salvation longer than he'll believe anything else. The word switchboard did not come up that night or ever again that I heard. The men had found out what the switchboard was for. It went on like that for hours. I lost count of the waves and I lost count of the hours. The rain never stopped. Time stopped meaning what it usually means and became instead a thing measured in fire missions, in the space between her saying a number and the iron arriving, in the slow shortening of the night that none of us believed in. The ammunition did not last forever, nothing does, and I watched her ration it without ever once seeming to hurry. There was a moment when one of the gun crews came up on the net with a number of their own, a count, how many rounds remained, and I saw her hear it, saw it land, saw her do something behind her eyes, and then she changed how she fought. She stopped firing for effect on every group. She started using single ranging rounds, one shell dropped precisely in front of a forming rush to break its courage rather than its bodies, to make 600 frightened men in the dark believe that the storm was still full when it was running dry. She husbanded death like a woman managing a fire through a long cold night so it lasts till morning, feeding it one stick at a time, knowing exactly how many sticks were in the woodpile because she had counted them herself 4 days before in the rain while they laughed at her. Numbers are how clerks avoid work, the first sergeant had said. Numbers were the only reason any of us saw the woodpile last till dawn. There was an hour before first light that I have decided not to describe in full, because some of the men who held that wire are still alive and some are not, and the ones who are not deserve better than to have their last hour turned into a paragraph by a man who was lying in a hole behind them with a wet notebook. I will say only this much, because it is necessary to the truth of what she did. They came one more time, the worst time, more of them than any time before, the whole remaining weight of that beaten force flung up the draw and the ford and the spur all at once, as though their commander had decided to spend everything he had left on one black rush in the last of the dark, before the light came up and took his cover away and showed him plainly what he had already lost. The single ranging rounds did not break this one. There were too many and they had been told, I think, that this was the last try and there was nothing behind it. And they reached the wire, reached it. We're on it, hands on it, and among the stakes she'd hammered in herself, and the line wavered, and the young private near me who had found his floor an hour before began to scream that they were through, they were inside, and I believed him, because I could see a shape come over the wire not 30 feet from me and go down under 3 men with bayonets. And for one black second I prepared, in whatever animal part of a man prepares for such things. To die in the mud at the end of a road I had come to write about. And Captain Mercer keyed the handset and said, in exactly the same low, even voice she had used all night, no faster, no louder, no tremor in it anywhere, Calder, Anvil, final protective fire, the wire, authenticate, fire. She brought the whole world down on the wire, on us. Closer than it is ever supposed to come, closer than any manual permits, danger close past the point where danger is even the word for it. She brought it down on her own front porch the way she had told me she would, standing in the rain the day before pointing at a fence built by a drunkard, and she trusted the math she had done in daylight when she could see, and the math held. And the men hugged the bottom of their holes while the air above the wire turned to fire and iron, and the assault that had its hands on our throats was simply erased, swept off the ridge in the space of a held breath, gone. I felt the heat of it on the back of my neck where I lay. I felt the ground try to come up and meet me, felt the whole hill ring like a struck bell. And when it was over there was a silence on that hill so total that I thought for a moment that I had gone deaf, that the world had simply stopped making sound, and into that silence, very quietly from very far away, the rain. She had not raised her voice once. In the whole of that long night, in 14 hours of it, she had not raised her voice once. I want that written down plainly because it is the center of everything I learned on that ridge. There was no scream of triumph, no cursing, no shaking fist at the dark, no tears when it might at last have been safe to weep, no gloating over the broken thing she had made of an enemy 1,000 meters down a draw. There was a woman on an ammunition crate with a red light in her teeth saying numbers, hour after hour, the same calm voice at the end of the night as at the start of it, and there was the dawn coming up gray and clean over a ridge that should not have been ours and was. It was the radio that gave her away in the end. her own kind of voice on a frequency that wasn't hers. In the gray before full light, when the firing had guttered out and the men were moving along the wire in the stunned slow way of men who have survived something they had given up surviving, touching one another on the shoulder, counting, a soldier she'd posted to the captured enemy frequency. She'd had a man monitoring it all night, of course she missed nothing. She had thought of the enemy's own radio as a source of fire support intelligence days before any of us thought of anything. That soldier sat up straight and went still, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face was the face of a man who has heard a ghost. She crossed to him, unhurried even then, and took the handset and listened, and I watched her listen, and I watched something pass over her that was not triumph and was not relief but was something more like grief, the grief of a person who recognizes, clearly and without flinching, the cost of a thing she has done well, the weight of all those broken men in the draw who were, an hour ago, also somebody's sons. She held the handset out to Tasker. "You should hear this," she said. "Your men should know what they did tonight. They earned the knowing." Tasker listened. I was close. I heard it too, the enemy commander's voice, thin and distorted and exhausted, speaking in his own tongue, and I did not need a translator for the shape of it, which was the shape of a man calling his own attack off, hauling his survivors back down a draw choked with his dead. And I heard the soldier translating it low and steady into the silence: "Break contact. All units break contact, pull back across the ford, get them home." And then a phrase the soldier hesitated over and translated. And that I have carried with me ever since. "He says break contact," the soldier said, his voice unsteady. "He says it's Anvil. He says we bled white against Anvil at the Vel, and he will not lose the rest of us on this hill to her too. He says get the living home, that's all that's left to do. He says that's Anvil up there." The soldier looked up from the handset at the small, still woman standing over him in the rain. "That's Anvil up there." The word went down the line faster than the dawn. Anvil, some of them knew it and some of them didn't, but the ones who knew it told the ones who didn't, in the hushed, disbelieving way men trade the name of a thing they thought was only a story. The Vel. Everyone on that hill, every soldier knew about the Vel, the way everyone in a trade knows the one great impossible job that got done by somebody before them, the standard against which they secretly measure themselves and come up short. A defense that should not have held by one fire support officer who had stood her ground and walked the steel down onto her own position, danger close again and again through a day and a night, until there was nothing left to call it on and almost nothing left to save, and who had walked out at the end of it with the few that lived and refused ever after to discuss it. A long way from here and a while ago she had told me with a door closing in her voice. I'd let the door close. I had been busy planning a piece about a road. I looked at the scar then, the fine white seam running up the back of her forearm and into her sleeve, the one I'd filed and forgotten. And I understood that I had been standing next to the Vel the whole time, that it walked around inside her sleeve, that the stillness I'd taken for the stillness of a clerk was the stillness of a person who has already been to the absolute bottom of this exact night once and paid for it. And come back anyway to stand on another ridge and do it again, because that is the work and she is the one who can do it. I have met few people in my life of whom that was true. I have written about fewer because I did not used to know how to see them, having decided years before that they did not exist. The relief column ground up the rebuilt stretch of road a little after full light, the engineers having worked the slide all night in the dark and the rain, throwing the road back across the mountainside by sheer stubbornness, so that help could climb a hill it could no longer reach in time to do anything but honor what had happened on it. The medevac came up behind the column, and the ridge filled with fresh men and stretcher-bearers and the loud, purposeful traffic of an outpost that is held, men who had not been there moving among men who had, the way the living move among the survivors, carefully, a little afraid of them. And it was then, in the mud, in the gray clean morning, that the thing happened that I came down off that mountain to write, the thing that is the real story and always was, the thing the editor with the coffee habit never knew he was sending me to find. First Sergeant Roy Tasker, the man who had called her a switchboard, who had stood at the door of her tent 4 days before with grievance in his weathered face, who had spread that word among his frightened men until it was the joke that held their fear at arm's length. First Sergeant Tasker turned to face the command tent where Captain Mercer sat. And without an order, without a word, without anyone telling him to or expecting it of him, that hard-slid rebuilt man drew himself up out of his exhaustion and his blood-stained sleeve and his grief for the men he hadn't been able to save, and came to attention in the mud and brought his hand up and held the salute. And the line followed him. I watched it ripple down the wire the way her fire had rippled up the draw in the dark, one man and then the next and then all of them, the green frightened survivors who had looked back over their shoulders at the start of the night and had not run because a woman on a crate had given them numbers to hold on to. They came to attention along that whole muddy ridge and held it, every one of them still on his feet, facing the tent. The young private who had found his floor in the worst of it stood straightest of all, his face wet with rain or something else, his hand rigid at his brow. Even the lieutenant, gray-faced, alive, propped on a stretcher with a field dressing at his throat and the bandage soaked dark, lifted the hand that still worked and held it, the boy who had taken her counsel under advisement and meant never to use it, saluting now with the only strength he had left. The whole cut-off element of Firebase Calder, what was left of it, 31 men still standing of the 41 who had started the night, stood in the mud at dawn and rendered honors to the fire support clerk. She did not see it. That is the part I most want you to understand because it is the part that tells you who she actually was all the way down. She did not turn around. She was still on the radio. She had the handset against her cheek and the map board on her knees, and she was reading casualty grids to the medevac pilots, calmly, clearly, square by square, this man here, this man at the base of the spur, two at the wire, so the aircraft could find the wounded in the broken, churned ground and not waste the minutes the worst of them did not have. And in between the grids she was adjusting one last fire, a few rounds onto the far side of the ford, to discourage anything in that beaten enemy from turning around and making the medevac pay on its way out, to keep the sky over the wounded clean. She was still working. The mission was not finished while there were wounded on the ground and aircraft in the air. And so she was not finished, and behind her an entire body of soldiers stood at attention with their hands to their brows in the rain, and she never knew because she did not have a spare moment in which to be saluted. The salute was the last thing on that ridge she had any use for. The wounded were the first. I stood at the edge of the tent and I did not lift my hand because I was a correspondent and not a soldier, and a man should not pretend to an honor he has not bought with the same coin as the men around him. But I took out my notebook, the ruined, wet thing I had carried up the road to write a clever piece about diligent functionaries, and I tore out the pages I had filled the first night, the ones with the angle on them, the switchboard, the map lady, the great machine of the army and its absurd grease pencils, all my practiced cleverness about a woman I had decided I understood from the door of a tent before she had said 10 words to me. I tore them out and I let the rain take them, watched the ink run and the paper go to pulp in the mud, and I started again on a clean page. And the first thing I wrote, the only thing I knew for certain in all that gray morning, was her name and the name of the thing she was. I have written a great many stories since. I am old now, older than Tasker was that night, and I have stopped telling people I stopped believing in heroes because that was always a lie a tired man told himself to keep from being disappointed, and I am done with it now at the end when there's no profit left in being clever. I believe in one. I believe in a woman on an ammunition crate in the rain who built her salvation 4 days early with a grease pencil while frightened men laughed at her, who held a doomed ridge through a 14-hour night against 600 with nothing but her own cold mastery and a string of numbers, and a voice that never once rose, who broke them so completely that their own commander begged his radio to let him take his living home before she buried them with the dead, and who, when an entire army of survivors stood at attention to honor her in the mud, never turned around because she was busy bringing the wounded out. They called her the switchboard. The first sergeant told me so himself the first hour I was there with grievance in his voice. I went and found him months later when I was writing the long version, the true one, the one I should have come to find. He had a different bearing by then, a quieter one, and when I asked him about the word he had used, he looked at me for a while the way he'd looked at me at the door of the tent, weighing what I was, and then he said the only thing I have ever heard that hard man say that came close to poetry. A switchboard, he said, is just the thing the whole line runs through, everything passes through it. You don't see it doing anything, so you decide it isn't doing anything. You walk past it 100 times and never give it a thought. He turned his withered face away down the road that had been rebuilt since, the road I'd first come up to write about, the road that quit whenever the sky felt like it. Then one night the line goes down, and you find out it was holding the whole thing together the entire time. You find out it was the only thing that was. I wrote it down, it's the last line of the true story, the one I should have come to find and almost missed. The road was never the story. The draw was never quite the story either, not really for all that she tried to point me at it. She was the story. She had been the story from the moment I dripped on her tent floor and decided in my cleverness that I already knew her. She was always the story. Her call sign was Anvil. You break against an anvil, it does not move. It does not need to. The hammer comes down and it's the hammer that wears away, and the anvil is still there in the morning, doing its quiet, unglamorous work, holding the shape of everything that was made on it. That's the whole of it, and it took me a washed-out road and a 14-hour night and an enemy's own radio begging in the dark to learn the meaning of a single plain word.